I'm very pleased to welcome you to the 35th Annual John Kennard Eddy Memorial Lecture on World Politics. This lectureship is in memory of John Kennard Jeff Eddy, who is a politics and government major at Ohio Wesleyan University in the late 1980s. Jeff had a keen interest in international affairs, and he and two classmates were on their way to a Russian studies seminar when their car was struck by a reckless driver, killing them. His parents, John and the late Ellen Eddy, generously contributed to make this lectureship possible. And while we're sad that John cannot be here, we are very pleased that John's son-in-law, Wayne Lafferty, and granddaughter, Megan Lafferty, were able to make it here. We're very grateful you were able to make it. And the Eddys also contributed to a scholarship. So there's an Eddy scholarship as well, and so one of our scholarship recipients is here as well. This lectureship has been a fitting memorial to Jeff's interests and a gift that keeps on giving to the owu community, allowing us to bring in leading thinkers to discuss important issues in international affairs. So this is such a wonderful legacy for Ohio Wesleyan and the Delaware community. And just continuing in our long line of distinguished speakers, I'm very pleased and honored to announce our speaker tonight, who's Ryan Hass. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington, and he also has graduate studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Ryan served as a foreign service officer, including service in South Korea and China. He served as the director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia with the National Security Council from 2013 to 2017. This included participation in helping to organize and run summit meetings between President Obama and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. So talk about being in the room where it happens. Ryan was definitely there. He's now director of the John L. Thornton China Center and the Chen Fu and Cecilia Yen Ku Chair in Taiwan Studies at the Brookings Institution. He's the author or editor of 4 books, including Stronger, Adapting America's China Strategy in an Age of Competitive Interdependence, published on Yale University Press. And so please join me in welcoming our speaker, Ryan Hass.
Well, thank you for such a warm welcome. Thank you, Professor Franklin, for the opportunity. And Wayne and Megan, we're honored by your presence here tonight to commemorate the Eddy Memorial Lecture on World Politics. The question I've been asked to address is a simple one. Are the United States and China destined for conflict? I hope when you leave tonight you have an answer in your own head to this question. I also recognize that it's a difficult question to wrestle with. The world feels pretty chaotic already. We have wars in Ukraine, in the Middle East, societal fissures here at home. I understand the impulse to want to try to push this problem away and not deal with it, but I encourage us not to look away. Because China is, after all, a country that has 1 out of every 5 human beings on Earth within its borders. It's the second largest economy in the world. It has significant military capabilities, including nuclear capabilities. And if the United States and China ever were to find themselves in conflict, the world as we know it would never be the same. So that's what we're up against. I'm going to try to use my opening comments to offer perspective on a couple of questions. What are the United States and China competing over? How will this competition unfold in the coming years? And how close are we today to the possibility of conflict? Can we avoid it? But I should mention at the outset that I am going to try to be deliberately efficient in my remarks, because my motivation for coming to Delaware is to hear you, to listen to your thoughts and your perspectives. So I welcome you to push back or challenge anything I'm about to say in the coming couple of minutes. So what are we competing over? There is a broad consensus across political parties in the United States that China's behavior is bad and that the public mood towards China is sour. This is noteworthy, but it's not unique. This is not the first time that the United States public opinion towards China has been negative. What's unique about this moment is that China has salience in the political debate in ways that it has not in the recent past. Public opinion polls show that Americans view China as the country's greatest enemy and threat. Overall, 50%, 1 out of every 2 Americans, believe that China is our greatest threat. But that number obscures a pretty significant gap in partisan perspectives on this question. 76% of Republicans see China as our greatest threat. 30% of Democrats do. For Democrats, Russia is the greatest threat, whereas Russia is seen as the greatest threat by only 12% of Republicans. There are areas where Americans do agree, however. 73% of the United States believes that there is an important imperative for the United States and China to avoid war. Most Americans favor a strong, smart, firm diplomatic approach towards China. But we have to accept that China is a larger issue in our politics today than it has been at any point, probably since 1989. 1989 was a significant moment. That was when the Tiananmen massacre occurred. And so the question is why? Why is it such a salient issue in our politics today? I'm going to offer three reasons. The first is that China has emerged as a truly near-peer competitor. And this is an unwelcome development for many people in the world that I live in, the policy community. For most of the lives of everyone in America's policy community, the United States has enjoyed being a unipolar power, being the sole superpower in the world, or we've been consumed by a global war on terror. It's been about 35 years since the United States last had a great power competitor. And just to put that in perspective, that means that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, was 13 years old the last time we dealt with this problem. So it's been a while. China's emergence, its rapid emergence, has pushed us back into the game of great power competition, a game that many in the United States wanted and hoped we had moved beyond. But China's policy posture also has shifted in recent years. Since President Xi assumed power in 2012, China has gone from a modest outward projection of its ambitions to a more hard-edged foreign policy that basically says unapologetically that China has a rightful return to its natural place at the head of the table of global politics. And in the past period of years, China has absorbed Hong Kong. It has built artificial islands in the South China Sea. It has imposed its will in the western reaches of Xinjiang. It has increased pressure on Taiwan. And it has drawn blood at the Sino-Indian border for the first time in decades. And as China's overall posture has shifted, so have attitudes toward China, not just in the United States, but really in every developed economy in the world. And at the same time, what is happening is coinciding with a period of immense turmoil inside the United States. We're going through a dramatic demographic transition as a country. We're navigating our way through the fourth industrial revolution. We've experienced in the last period of years significant setbacks from September 11th to the global financial crisis, Iraq, Afghanistan. And all these events, when you put them together, have intensified societal and political tensions and given rise or space for populism and deep partisanship to take root. And so in other words, there has been sort of this near-perfect storm of China experiencing a rapid rise at the same time as America feels a bit hobbled at home. And this feeling hasn't sat well with many people across our country. It's fed a strong impulse and desire to try to push China back, to put it back in its place. And this view is reflected in our national debates. President Biden has referred to his counterpart, Xi Jinping, as a dictator and a thug in public. He's vowed to make sure that America outcompetes China. President Trump has talked about the need to get tougher with China, to punch back at the injustices that they have inflicted upon us. He's focused mostly on trade and promised to return jobs to the industrial heartland. And two other prominent Republicans, Mike Gallagher and Matt Pottinger, last week published an article that called for the United States to try to roll back China's advances in global influence and invigorate efforts to promote regime change inside China. And this is part of the reason why events such as ours today are so important, because they give us space to step back from the daily passions, to sort of think through these challenges, to take stock of China's strengths and weaknesses, as well as what type of relationship we want with China and how best to go about pursuing it. In order to do this effectively, though, we need to have a clear sense of the nature of the competition. Going back to the question, what is it that we are competing over with China? And in asking this question, it's often seductive to fall back on historical analogies. The historic analogy that has the most salience in Washington, D.C., where I come from, is the analogy of the Cold War. It's a little bit like slipping into a warm bath. It feels good, it's comfortable. We navigated through the Cold War with the Soviet Union without having a conflict. We ended up winning. Why can't we do that again? As appealing as this analogy is, I would encourage us to interrogate it a bit before we accept it, though. Because unlike the Cold War, the world today is not fragmenting into United States and Chinese blocs. The crux of the competition today between the United States and China is not primarily military, as it was with the Soviets. In the current moment, today, we have deep and unbreakable interdependencies that exist between the United States and China. There's over $575 billion with a B in annual trade. There are deep societal and scientific linkages between our two societies. And there's a mutual awareness in both countries that we are stuck, whether we like it or not, on the same planet. So when one country pollutes, the other country feels it. When a pandemic erupts in one country, it affects the other. Rather than being captains of opposing teams, the United States and China, more so, I would argue, are two countries that are pulling away from every other country in the world in overall national power. In other words, the key dynamic in the global environment today is that the gap in relative national power between the United States and China and every other country in the world is expanding on a year-by-year basis. Even as it is doing so, America still maintains pretty fundamental advantages and relative strengths compared to China. And so my argument to you is that at the most fundamental level, the core of what the United States and China are competing over is a proposition over which country's governance system is best able to deliver solutions to challenges that we will face in this coming century. Both countries believe that they have a governance system that is best equipped to unlock the talents of their people. They both believe that the country that demonstrates success will enjoy the pull of power in the international system. They're both determined to find ways to outpace the other and outperform the other across a range of dimensions. And they both just fundamentally believe that performance will define prestige. Whichever country performs best will enjoy the pull of power on the world stage. So if you accept this, that the United States and China are basically locked into a competition to determine which governance system can outperform the other, the next question is, how is this competition going to unfold? And one of the shared features of the relationship between the United States and China today is that both sides are pretty frustrated with the status quo. Neither celebrates the current moment in the relationship that we find ourselves in. The United States is pretty frustrated with China's behavior, its growing state intervention in its economy, its increasing use of repression to control society at home, and its increasing bullying of other countries, including American allies, along its periphery. Many American leaders are also concerned about China's support for non-democratic leaders and Beijing's seeming interest in eroding liberal norms around the world, such as the idea of individual liberties and human rights. But to be fair, China's leaders also are pretty frustrated. Their argument is that the United States is seeking to suppress China's rise and limit its expansion and influence around the world. President Xi has given voice to this. He has accused the United States of leading efforts to encircle, contain, and suppress China. They point to America's restrictions on Chinese access to high-tech items, such as semiconductors, and the equipment used to make them as evidence of America's determination to hold China back. And they believe that the United States is trying to lock China into a subordinate status below us. So we're both growing a bit more pessimistic about the relationship. And as a consequence, both countries are divesting in efforts to stabilize and manage the relationship and doubling down on efforts to try to gird for long-term competition with the other. We see this most clearly in China's case, their efforts to strengthen relations with Russia, despite Russia's aggression in Ukraine. The Chinese treat their partnership with Russia as instrumental to their efforts to push back against what they term Western pressure. President Xi seems to have calculated that he is safer in the world standing back to back with President Putin than he would be standing alone and facing a hostile world on his own. We also see this in China's efforts to prioritize deepening ties with the developing world. China bills itself as the leader of the developing world, the driving force of the BRICS mechanism that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They argue that collective action amongst the developing world is needed to push back against an unfair international system that favors the strong at the expense of the weak. And the common thread that ties all these pieces together is that they are all supportive of my impression of the thing that gets Xi Jinping up in the morning, the thing that animates him, that energizes him, which is promoting the political stability and security of himself and his political party, the Chinese Communist Party. I don't think that China would like to confront the United States in some cosmic military clash that determines superiority. I don't think that they have a strategy available to them to knock us off our pedestal and claim leadership in the world. But I'll tell you what they do want. They want us to take a lesson from London. They want us to become more like the United Kingdom, to become a fading global power that gracefully accepts its own decline. And the fact of the matter is, not many people in the United States are enthusiastic about that. We're not very interested in accommodating China's ambition. And in China's mind, this is the principal cause of rising U.S. tensions. So Americans don't see any incentive to step aside and allow China to assume the role of global leader. And in recent years, under both President Trump and President Biden, America's leaders have focused on self-strengthening, on rebuilding America's strength at home to improve our ability to project power abroad. And I think we all can agree that President Trump and President Biden have different visions for how to achieve this objective, but they do agree on the broad goal of restoring America's strength and pushing it back against Chinese actions that challenge our interests. And this has been the spirit of President Biden's overall strategy. In shorthand, it is to invest at home, to align with allies, and to compete responsibly in dealing with China. And the Biden team, if members of the administration were here, they would say they feel good about the generational investments that have been unlocked. Over $2 trillion in investment in clean energy, infrastructure, semiconductors, advanced manufacturing. But even with these advances, the Biden team still feels a bit uncomfortable with the current levels of interdependence that exist between the United States and China economically. They believe that our overdependence upon China creates vulnerabilities for the United States and gives China leverage that they shouldn't have. And so their remedy to this problem has been to try to encourage what they call friend shoring. The idea of friend shoring is to shift supply chains to countries who are not hostile to American interests or values, to promote predictable and resilient supply chains, to basically move value chains from China to Southeast Asia, to India, to Mexico, and other places. Even so, we're finding that there are limits to how much value chains can shift from China. And we see this in the travel of our leaders, of our industrial leaders. Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Jensen Huang, all these guys travel to China very regularly because our value chains remain deeply interdependent with China's. And what this tells us is that there will be certain disentanglement of our value chains around high-end items like semiconductors. But it's hard to imagine a full-scale economic decoupling anytime soon between the world's largest and second largest economies. And in fact, the data just tells us the opposite story. Even in spite of the tension that exists in the U.S.-China relationship, U.S.-China trade is at or near record levels today. And this is symptomatic of a broader point, which is that there are and will continue to be limits around the scope of competition that exists between the United States and China. And in my own experience around both President Biden and President Xi, I think that there is a recognition on the part of both leaders that conflict would destroy both countries' pursuit of their national ambitions. And in an interesting way, both leaders believe that they will be in a better position to compete with the other in the future than they are today. So they both have a certain degree of incentive to manage tensions in the current moment to build their strength for the future. Now, I want to be fair with you. There are many people in Washington, D.C. who clamor for a more confrontational posture towards China than what I'm describing to you today. They believe that China's leaders respect strength and exploit weakness, and that the solution to dealing with China is to push back more strongly so that China pulls back in pursuit of its ambitions. Even so, even the most hawkish friends in my community in Washington, D.C. all operate under the same constraint: a deep recognition that a U.S.-China conflict would be absolutely catastrophic. And this is a dynamic that is visible in how the relationship is managed. President Biden and President Xi and President Trump before President Biden have taken personal oversight in managing this relationship. They have stepped in when the relationship has overheated. They have been a cooling mechanism for tensions. They have set expectations that there should be no conflict, no confrontation, no Cold War. And they have been very effective in realizing these goals. There has not been conflict. There is not yet Cold War. There have certainly been moments of confrontation, but they have been time-bound. And I think that the relationship will probably stay stuck in this uncomfortable, unsatisfying space between competition and confrontation for some time. So while the risk of conflict is not high, I also want to emphasize it is not zero. A big reason why the risk of war is not zero is that the United States and China have visions for the future of Asia that are just fundamentally in tension with each other. The United States sees Asia as the world's most dynamic region, the growth engine of the global economy in the 21st century. And from a strategic standpoint, we are absolutely determined to preserve unimpeded access to the region, to uphold the credibility of our alliance commitments, and to prevent any other country from dominating Asia at our expense. These are just foundational underpinnings of American grand strategy and the basis of America's global superpower status. But as we were talking about before, China is unsatisfied with the status quo. They believe that Beijing is deserving of greater freedom of action, greater space to exercise its influence. They would like for us to basically retreat to Hawaii. We'll take care of the area east of Hawaii. They can take care of everything else in Asia. And once they succeed in doing that, they believe, they will be able to compel smaller neighbors to be more accommodating of their preferences, including their preferences over where territorial lines should be drawn around Taiwan and the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Sino-Indian border, and elsewhere. From Beijing's perspective, the reason why these smaller countries are challenging and pushing back against their territorial claims is because we, the United States, are standing behind them and urging them, emboldening them to resist. And so if the United States is pushed out of the picture, as Beijing's thinking goes, then smaller powers will understand their fate, will grow less likely to resist, and ultimately will succumb to Beijing's demands. So what I'm trying to tell you is that leadership in Asia is going to remain contested for some period, because I'm not aware of anyone who is encouraging the United States to withdraw from Asia back to Hawaii. But even as we analyze these areas of friction and tension, we also owe it to ourselves to step back a bit and contemplate what conflict would look like if we ever found ourselves there. If the United States and China ever were to find themselves in conflict, it would be difficult for either side to limit the expansion of the conflict or the escalation of the conflict. The conflict over Taiwan, for example, which is an island 90 miles off the coast of China that China claims as its own, it would not remain limited to dogfights and naval skirmishes in the Taiwan Strait. It would quickly become a sprawling global affair where we would each be trying to exploit the other side's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The conflict would quickly spread to space, to cyberspace, potentially also into the nuclear domain. The United States likely would seek to weaponize China's dependence upon oil imports, and China would likely halt shipments of rare earth elements to the United States, basically putting a pause on U.S. auto and other manufacturing. And the level of risk inherent in this exercise speaks to the reason why there has never in human history ever been a conflict between two nuclear-armed powers with long-range strike, space, and cyber capabilities, such as the United States and China possess. If a war ever were to start, it would be incredibly difficult to stop. And leaders in Washington and Beijing understand this. I've seen it up close with my own eyes. They are very sober to the degree of risk that exists in allowing escalation to run away from us. So just to bring us to a close and move us into our conversation, I hope I have offered you a framework to think through how current events and future events raise or lower risk of conflict. I hope I have left you with a sense that the United States and China are simultaneously interdependent and at the same time involved in a hardening rivalry with each other. It requires us to hold two contradictory thoughts in our head at once to be able to see the full picture. We are inherently engaged in a systems competition to determine which model is more capable of delivering results for their people. And the risk is not high, but it also is not zero that we could find ourselves in conflict. The sharpest area of competition for leadership will be in Asia, and this is the space we should watch. And with that, I thank you for giving me this opportunity, this alibi to take a break from studying for finals, and I look forward to our conversation together.
Okay, I just want to tell you what's happening now. Professor Ji-Young Choi, who's a member of our department with expertise in international relations and East Asian politics, he's going to serve as discussant, maybe ask some questions and offer his own comments. And then after a few minutes of that, we're going to open it up to the audience, and I hope that you will join in asking questions as well. And we have somebody who has a microphone, so if you have a question, wait for the microphone to come to you.
Okay, first, thank you for your insightful presentation. I think the topic is very interesting but also very critical. I think maybe the most important issue in the study of international relations today. But I have somewhat different views. Definitely, I'm a little bit more pessimistic for various reasons. First, I think there are so many territorial disputes, unlike in Europe after the end of World War II. Many historical issues, territory issues were very clearly resolved. But unfortunately, in East Asia, there are so many, not only South China Sea and Taiwan, how about North Korea and South Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and East China Sea, Senkaku Islands, and Kuril Islands between Russia and Japan. I think there are so many flashpoints. So I think definitely Washington and Beijing, they are doing their best to manage competition without any conflict. But to be honest, it's more and more difficult to manage because so many actors are involved. Particularly Taiwan, I think definitely the number one flashpoint. But I think if I add more information, why China has a strong interest in occupying Taiwan, I think there are three very strong incentives: political, economic, and strategic incentives. The first one is reunification with Taiwan could be the biggest political achievement. Xi Jinping is politically very ambitious. If it happens, definitely Xi Jinping will be praised in reunification with Taiwan. It's kind of a historic mission of mainland China. Secondly, as you know, Taiwan is one of the main producers of microchips. But the problem is the U.S. and its allies are trying to limit the transfer of key technologies to China. So it's a main concern for China. If China can control Taiwan, China could be self-sufficient in production of microchips. TSMC is the biggest producer of advanced microchips. So definitely a lot of economic incentives. Thirdly, as you know, Taiwan is located between mainland China and South China Sea. If China can control Taiwan, it's easier for China to control also South China Sea. So for these three main reasons, I think definitely China has a very strong incentives. And of course, their goal is to achieve reunification with Taiwan without any military conflict. But as far as I know, they are willing to use military force if it's necessary and if there is any chance. I think that is the main concern. And also the South China Sea, you mentioned a little bit about South China Sea, global trade that passes through the South China Sea accounts for more than 1/3 of global maritime trade, and 80% of China's energy imports passes through also the South China Sea. So from the perspective of China, it is really important who controls the South China Sea. If there is any warfare, what happens if the U.S. cuts off sea lanes in the South China Sea is so devastating to China. So that's why China has been very adamant when it comes to the South China Sea. So I think the only way to avoid military conflict is the U.S. gives up Taiwan and the South China Sea. So it means, okay, you can take over. China definitely has a strong desire to become a hegemonic power in East Asia. But hegemonic power means there are only one single power. If power is shared, it's not hegemonic power. But I don't think the U.S. will give up as well. Taiwan is so important. Microchips, global supply chains, particularly the supply of microchips, are so important for the U.S. economy. And also the South China Sea, definitely. The U.S. has adopted freedom of navigation operations, sending ships intentionally going through the South China Sea, but sometimes there are naval clash. Recently, there was naval clash between Philippines and China. So I think, and of course, the military conflict is not inevitable, but I think compared to 10 years, 20 years, I think the probability of military conflict has increased rather than decreased, in my view. So I think that's why I think I have more concerns, compared to 10 years, 20 years. And also, we have to understand new security challenges U.S. faces. After the end of World War II, the U.S. accounted for 50% of world manufacturing, but now the U.S.'s portion declined to 16%. China accounts for 30% of world manufacturing. And also, during the Cold War, the U.S. had to deal with only Soviet Union. But Soviet Union's GDP was less than 50% of the GDP of the U.S. But now China's GDP is reaching nearly 80% of GDP of the United States. And moreover, not only China, the re-emerging Russia, nuclear development in North Korea, and also Iran. So I think it is not unrealistic that the U.S. may have to engage in multiple warfares in multiple locations, in Europe or Middle East or East Asia at the same time. So I think that is the biggest dilemma of the United States. What happens if... and also another problem is, how about public opinions? I'm not sure how many Americans will support that U.S. sends its military troops to Taiwan to defend Taiwan. And also, as you mentioned, it should not happen. But I think the possibility is very high. If China invades Taiwan, if U.S. intervenes, it can escalate into bigger conflict because Japan and Australia are also willing to support the United States, because the Japan's concern is China will not just satisfied with occupying Taiwan. the next target could be Senkaku Islands, East China Sea. So that's why Japan, Australia will support the US, and then maybe some of American forces in South Korea can be deployed, and also North Korea can take advantage of this. So I think it can escalate into bigger conflict. So I think things are very, very dangerous. Yeah.
Well, good. I didn't realize we were going to have a debate, but here we are. So let me tell you why I think he's wrong. First, on Taiwan, and I say this with tremendous respect because Dr. Choi and I have known each other, we have many mutual friends, and I have tremendous respect for his work. On Taiwan, Beijing's goal is to achieve its objective at the lowest cost and risk. They don't want to fight a war. They want Taiwan to accept that the only path to peace and prosperity runs through Beijing. Part of the reason why China doesn't want to fight a war over Taiwan is because China has indivisible risks that it cannot solve for. It is dependent upon imports of oil to continue to fuel its economy. It has to feed 20% of the world's population with 4% of the world's arable land. These are problems that don't have solutions, at least in the near term. China's oil comes from the Middle East. The route from the Middle East to China runs through the Gulf, it runs through the Indian Ocean. Those are areas that the United States Navy has absolute dominance of. Xi Jinping can't afford to not feed his people. He has indivisible risks that he doesn't have solutions for. He doesn't want to fight with us. And another reason he doesn't want to fight with us is because he's watched what happened with his buddy, Vladimir Putin, who accepted the advice of his military advisors on what his military was capable of doing. How is that turning out for Vladimir Putin? Horribly. Xi Jinping faces a strategic situation that's far more complex than having an inferior country on a landlocked border that it can drive tanks over. It's a 90-mile moat that separates Taiwan from China, which, to put it in geographic perspective, is 3 times the width of the English Channel that we can think back to for D-Day. Xi Jinping has been firing his Minister of Defense, the head of his rocket command. Why? Because he doesn't trust that they're carrying out the instructions that he's giving them. And so, as I look at the same picture that Dr. Choi was describing, I don't see a leader that has his finger on the trigger and is eager to pull it. I agree with Dr. Choi that it's possible that we could find ourselves in a conflict, but I don't think that's the plan for either side. On the South China Sea, the second issue that Dr. Choi brought up, the United States and China are in a mutually unsatisfying stalemate. China has built these artificial islands in the South China Sea. We hate them. We continue to operate our Navy in the South China Sea. China hates it. But we can't push them off their islands any more than they can push our Navy out of the South China Sea without risking a war that neither of us would be able to control. And so we're stuck in this mutually unsatisfying status quo, and we will be for the foreseeable future. The idea that China has hegemonic ambitions, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they want to be the leader in Asia? That's their view of themselves. The term China, Zhongguo, is central country. That's their name. That's their view of themselves. They see themselves as the central country in Asia and the world. I completely agree with Dr. Choi that they have hegemonic ambitions. But they also have the hardest strategic environment of any country in the world. They're surrounded by 4 countries that are nuclear powers. They have territorial disputes with 7 countries along their periphery. And if you stand in Shanghai and look out, you see the United States Navy, the United States Air Force, and then when you look past that, you see Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, the first island chain where the United States has a military presence or partnerships all along China's periphery. We're not going anywhere. A lot of leaders have had hegemonic ambitions. For all but one of them over the past 200 years, they've ended pretty poorly. If you think back to Russia, to Napoleon, to Hitler, to the Japanese, they all had hegemonic ambitions. The story ends bad for countries who pursue it. Establishing hegemony is extremely hard. And then finally, It's true that China's economy has grown substantially. It's true that they manufacture a lot more than they did before, and that they manufacture a lot more in the United States. Fortunately for us, our economy is not driven by manufacturing. And if you look at a comparative between the United States and Chinese economies, I'd take ours over theirs any day of the week and twice on Sunday. 9 of the 10 largest companies in the world by market capitalization are American. The largest Chinese company in the world by market capitalization, Tencent, is 26th in overall market capitalization. The gap in economic size between the United States and China is widening, not narrowing, as the United States economy outperforms and China's underperforms on a dollar-weighted basis. There are more people leaving China this year than at any year since 1989 in the shadow of Tiananmen Square. Why? Because the situation inside China is looking bleak and they're seeking opportunities elsewhere, including in the United States. China also is bleeding capital. They used to be a magnet for foreign direct investment. Now it's leaving. What country in the world is the largest magnet for foreign direct investment? The United States. So, yes, China is a formidable challenger. Yes, China has extensive strengths, but when you stack them up, we look a hell of a lot stronger than they do.
Yeah, I'm going to have a short comment, and then we're going to open questions from the floor. Yeah, I think definitely China has so many domestic problems. Sometimes we look at economic data, and then sometimes we cannot see so many internal problems China faces. But sometimes there is a gap between their ambitions and capabilities. So even though they do not have enough capabilities, because of political ambitions, they challenge the existing powers. If we look at some historical patterns, Japan did, even though Japan is inferior militarily, they invaded Pearl Harbor, for example. So that's why I'm not saying that China will become hegemonic power in terms of military and economic capabilities. I'm more focusing on political ambitions, because political ambitions are causing some wishful thinking, or they overestimate their power and capabilities and underestimating competitors. Otherwise, we cannot explain. If Chinese leaders behave very rationally, I don't think they will engage in any warfare. It's kind of suicidal. But if you look at history, there are so many cases, right? They, as I mentioned, some gap between ambitions and capabilities, and some wishful thinking rather than rational, assessment of their capabilities and competitors' capabilities. Okay, I think it's time to open questions. So, yeah.
So I enjoyed this debate. I am always excited to see public discourse with academics on a big stage. But my question is, well, I have two. The first one, I learned today, the U.S.'s interesting relationship with South Korea, and I wanted to know what role, if any, does our ties with South Korea, namely our military interests with South Korea, would have in this future potential conflict? And then my second question is, what role do either of you think nationalism or patriotism, both U.S. and China, right? What role could that play in a potential conflict?
Great questions. I'll defer to Dr. Choi on the first question. He is a genuine expert on.
So I'm sorry, what was your first question again? I could not quite understand. The first question?
What role would the South Korean military play in a potential conflict between the
Oh, yeah. Actually, we talked about Taiwan and the South China Sea. The third main flashpoint is Korean Peninsula. We didn't have a chance to talk much about it because North Korea is the only allied country of China. They signed mutual security pact. So if there is any war, they have an obligation to support each other, right? And also definitely the South Korea is allied with the United States. So it is not just North Korea and South Korea. Behind them, China and the United States. So that's why if there is the second Korean War, I think the possibility is very high. It can escalate into bigger conflict because two superpowers, as China did at the first Korean War, definitely China is willing to enter the second Korean War. So that's why now in South Korea there is a voice that it is time to think about developing nuclear weapons because the U.S. always stands by. U.S. is a strong supporter of South Korea, but some South Koreans have a doubt about whether U.S. is willing to, defend Seoul, even though there is North Korea's nuclear attack against Washington, D.C. or L.A., and also whether U.S. is willing to risk a nuclear war with China if China is involved in the second Korean War. And also we talked about new security challenges the U.S. faces. So that's why even in Washington, D.C., it's not dominant view, but some think tank people, they begin to think about it because the U.S. cannot deal with China and Russia, Iran, so many countries. If South Korea and Japan have nuclear weapons, definitely it is counterweight not only against North Korea, but also China. So that's why it is not the first option. It should be the last option, but it is time to think about it against the rise of China. And the second question you made?
Yeah. Second question is the role of nationalism and patriotism in fueling U.S.-China tensions. I think it's a really perceptive question. The way that I have thought about it, and I welcome your thoughts on this because I know that you spend a lot of time thinking about these issues in a domestic U.S. context, but the more sort of cool-eyed, cold-blooded we are in calculating our interests and the Chinese are in theirs, the lower the risk of conflict is. The more hot-blooded, passionate, patriotic, and nationalistic we are in defining our interests than the Chinese are in defining theirs, the higher the potential for conflict. In the case of China, for 35 years, China's leaders earned performance legitimacy based upon the speed of their economic growth. So they could say to their people, next year is going to be better than this year, and the year after that's going to be better than next year. We're going to have 10% growth, and yes, you will have some of your political rights curbed, but your overall life is going to get better. That's not an option that's available to Chinese leaders anymore as China's growth decelerates. They're now in the 3, 4, 5% range. In the coming 5 years, most people expect they'll be in the 2, 3, 4% range. And then from there, they're going to, basically perform like a large economy would, grow at 2, 3, 4%. So they can no longer depend upon economic growth as a source of performance legitimacy. What else is going to allow a Chinese Communist Party that doesn't run elections to have legitimacy inside their country? Nationalism and repression are the two tools that Xi Jinping is increasingly relying upon to build and strengthen cohesion within Chinese society. And so if you sort of accept the idea of us being on a spectrum, it looks like China's end of the spectrum is getting hotter rather than colder. And we all live in the United States, so I'll allow you all to comment on where we are in this spectrum. But my general sense is that we're probably moving towards hotter rather than colder in the present moment as well.
I find it interesting, the talk tonight in light of the TikTok decision and what will happen, and I'd be interested in your comments on that as just kind of a proxy for international challenges that we face. Secondly, the demographic challenges that the country faces. And then thirdly, is there a framework for thinking about renormalizing relations? You think of the diplomacy of the Nixon administration in opening relations and all of the celebration that brought forward. And up until the last 10 years, I think there was just much more optimism on our side And that has obviously, in light of these kind of hot-blooded comments, has subsided. So I don't know if there's thinking about renormalizing, how we should be thinking about that. Thank you.
I think Washington's strategy was to induce China open its economy, and then also Washington expected there should be more political reforms, but unfortunately it did not happen. So that's why I think there is no secret anymore that Washington began to perceive China as a strategic and economic competitor. Ryan mentioned that the new corridor did not start yet, but some experts see that it already started. But it's definitely different from the first corridor. It's more about technology warfare, because in the past, China exported many cheap labor-intensive goods, but not anymore. China has been very successful in upgrading their technologies. So definitely, when Washington began to perceive China as a competitor, definitely from the Trump administration, they began to, check limiting the transfer of key technologies to China, including microchips, and also in the future AIs and quantum computers and many other areas. There will be more competition. So I think in the past, I think more dovish people were more dominant in Washington, D.C., but particularly after the COVID-19, I think more anti-Chinese sentiment became stronger. As of now, there are more hawkish people, are more dominant. I'm not saying it's not impossible to get back to the previous model, but as of now, but there is a good sign. Last year in San Francisco, two leaders met together, and then for the first time, right, in several years, they trying to manage competition without any conflict. Two worst case scenarios are economic decoupling and then direct military conflict, particularly in Taiwan and the South China Sea. So I think there is some sign of improvement. And also, we didn't mention about it. Actually, there is a room and space for cooperation about nuclear proliferation and climate change and terrorism and many other issues. There is significant room for cooperation. So, but I'm not sure they will be able to, overcome some core security issues, particularly over Taiwan and the South China Sea. Without Taiwan and South China Sea, I believe there is a very ample space for improvement, but I'm not sure they will be able to overcome when it comes to core security issues.
I think Dr. Cherry captured it very well. I'll just try to tick through the questions really quick. On TikTok, I was telling Wayne and Megan before we got together that I have a 16-year-old daughter, so this is not just sort of an abstraction to me. This is something that I'm paying careful attention to myself. My own just expectation is that Congress will pass legislation to force the divestiture of TikTok, and that TikTok will challenge this in the courts, and the courts will ultimately be the arbiters of whether or not TikTok continues to operate inside the United States. And the fundamental question that the judges will have to weigh is, does the national security threat that TikTok poses present enough of a direct threat to the United States that it overrides the free speech protections that Americans are accustomed to enjoying? And it's really hard. I just can't say how the judges are going to come out on that question, but that's fundamentally the question that they will have to resolve. On the issue of demographics, it's a really important question because China's demographic profile is sort of following the trajectory of Japan's, where it's getting older and older and older. There are more old people, fewer young people, not many babies on a relative basis being born inside China. And there are two ways that China can deal with this. The first is they can allow more people to immigrate into China, which is unlikely to happen. I guess second, they could encourage Chinese people to have more babies, which they have been doing, and Chinese people have been having less, not more babies. They don't want to have more babies. And then the third way that they can sort of continue to grow their economy with less people is to automate more of their economy. And if you watch videos of how electric vehicles are made in China today, it will absolutely blow your mind, because the one notable feature of it is that there are no humans in the videos. These are all robotic arms that are slapping together pieces of steel, creating Xiaomi and other electric vehicles that sell for a quarter of the cost of what we produce in the United States. But that's China's big bet for overcoming the demographic dip that they have. And then finally, on the issue of, is it possible for the United States and China to reconceptualize their relationship, to get out of sort of this descending dark hole that we find ourselves in? I agree with Dr. Choi that in the near term it's very hard to see, but that doesn't mean that we should give up on the project. Because the one thing that I've taken away from reviewing the past 45 years of the U.S.-China relationship is that it never travels on a straight line for very long, right? You had this period between 1950 and 1972 where we had no contact with each other. We had deep enmity. We thought we were on rival teams in a Cold War bloc-like structure. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon tested the proposition, realized no, in fact, we share a common enemy in the Soviet Union. We come together. There is a period of sort of optimism about the development of the relationship that gets shattered in 1989 with the Tiananmen massacre, and then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we no longer have a shared enemy. The relationship recovers around the idea of the shared benefit of bringing China into the global trading system, which creates wealth inside China and inside the United States. And then we have shared challenges from climate change, Ebola, and other things that sort of last up until 2017, at which case the areas of common purpose fade and the areas of competition rise. That's where we are today. But I have no indication that where we are today is a terminal point and that forevermore from this point forward we will be stuck on this linear line. So as long as Xi Jinping is in power, which looks like it's going to be for a while, I think that we're going to have a pretty testy relationship with China. But fortunately, the actuarial table applies to him the same way that it applies to the rest of us. And so we need to be able to carry forward thinking into the future.
Yeah, if I add one more thing, China has so many domestic problems, particularly real estate bubbles, and then the expansion of black market in financial sectors, and then slower economic growth, aging population. There are so many issues. So I think it can provide a new chance for the United States, giving some time for the U.S. to renew its economy, particularly, Chips and Science Act passed to encourage American companies and foreign companies to invest in the U.S. and produce microchips. The problem is East Asia produces 75% of microchips. So particularly South Korea, Taiwan, and China and Japan. So it is just one of the ways to check China and then encouraging more production in the United States. If it's successful, definitely the U.S. has a chance. But one main concern is it's good that for the Chinese economy go down, but sudden collapse of China's economy, I think it's one of the scenarios because so many problems accumulated and then all of a sudden real estate bubbles burst out and then China's economy collapses. But it's not good for the world economy, for the US economy. And also one main concern is, as you know, China is not a democratic country, a one-party rule, and Xi Jinping can use the chance, for example, to divert people's attention to external security issues to avoid, people's complaints. I think that is one of my main concerns. If the economy goes down continuously, Xi Jinping can use Taiwan or China Sea to divert people's attention.
Is there a significant element within the Chinese Communist Party that, aside from Xi Jinping, who would be willing to play a waiting game? How patient is China on these issues? China's been around a long, long time, a lot longer than us. How patient are they When you look at the level of public debt, the sustainability of our public debt in this country and its impact on the ability of our government in the years to come to project its influence in the world, the dysfunctional politic we have here, how patient is China? Are there thinkers there that are willing to wait?
Well, thank you for the question. Part of the reason why I mentioned that both leaders believe that time is on their side is because it actually has a calming effect on the relationship. If you think that you're going to be in a more competitive position tomorrow than you are today, then you can afford to be patient to deal with the challenge from the other country tomorrow, because you'll be in a stronger position to do so. And the Chinese leadership is still capable of telling itself a story that is soothing. The story that they tell themselves is, look, the United States has ballooning debt. It is proving diminishingly capable, less and less capable of actually producing things. Societal fissures are widening and deepening. The economy is becoming more sort of heavily weighted to the financial sector. And there's a real possibility that the United States people will reelect President Trump, who places less priority upon America's alliances, which are an underpinning of America's global influence. And so we can, we have problems of our, so the Chinese leadership tells themselves, we've got problems of our own, but look at those guys. Like, they're a mess. And that gives them a bit of space for what you're describing, which is a degree of patience. That's why Dr. Choi and I had a friendly disagreement over whether or not there is a urgency to deal with these issues. I don't, I've been around President Xi 14, 15 times. I don't have the sense that he feels like it's now or never, like we've got to do it now, because he thinks that we are sowing the seeds of our own demise. And it's sort of up to us to prove him wrong.
First of all, thank you for coming. Lots of good food for thought. Another player in the region that we haven't really mentioned yet is India. And I'm wondering what role or impact you might see India playing in the US-China dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because India is growing fast economically. India will become the third largest economy, replacing Japan and Germany in coming years. So that's why Trump administration began to use the term India-Pacific rather than Asia-Pacific. So the strategy is to embrace India as a counterweight to China. And also there is Quad was launched. It is informal security forum. There are 4 countries, US, India, Japan, and Australia. They also conduct joint military exercises, sometimes including non-Quad members, South Korea or New Zealand and some other countries. So definitely India will play a bigger role to check the rise of China. And then not only for the United States, also actually I went to Ohio State University. There was a lecture on Japan's grand strategy in the 21st century. It is Indo-Pacific strategy. So Japan also knows the importance of India. And also South Korea, we already began to talk about Indo-Pacific strategy rather than Asia-Pacific strategy. So definitely India will play a bigger role in the future for US, Japan, and US allies to embrace India to check the power of China. Microphone is.
At one point, didn't President Obama establish just a political, not a military, but a political economic relationship with countries on the Chinese side and also on the west coast of South America, and it was not a military effort, but it was linking them all in a political and economic relationship. And it seemed to me that was kind of an important thing that happened. And yet it did not persist. And I would like you to comment on whether that could have been a success if it hadn't come to an untimely end. Actually, should I go on and say why it came to an untimely end? It's just too political.
So it came to an untimely end, just to get to the punchline, on the first day that President Trump was in office. The package was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was a strategy to try to link together all these economies along the Pacific Rim around a shared set of standards to promote free trade amongst members of the most dynamic economic growth engine of the world. And the proposition to China was that if and when they rose their standards in terms of policy openness to match the rest of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that they would be welcome to join too. The world would be a better place if they were a part of it. But until and unless they opened up their economy to make for a level playing field, then they would be on the outside and the rest of the region would come together. And it would create pretty significant pressure upon China. This got caught up in the sort of the popular shift away from free trade in the United States. Bernie Sanders first came out opposing the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Donald Trump did, and then eventually Hillary Clinton did as well. And President Trump vowed that if he were elected, that on his first day in office, he would withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a pledge that he followed through on. So that's sort of how we ended up where we are. And to this day, in the United States, there is still not a political center that is willing to push for moving back in the direction of free trade, and I think that the politics just doesn't support it in the current environment.
Let's have maybe one or two more questions. Let's see if maybe students have. I don't think students have asked questions, so if any of our students have questions.
If Joe Biden does get reelected, do you think that conflict may increase because of his public image of being like vulnerable and weak, and do you think that like influences China's like push towards conflict?
I think the main concern should be the election of Donald Trump instead of because Joe Biden will continue the current policies. I don't think there will be some radical changes toward China. Actually, there's no big difference when it comes to trade policies and economic policies toward China between Trump and Biden. And I think there will be no dramatic changes, trade economic policies. And also Trump actually started kind of trade war. The possibility is very, very high. He will try again. And also, when it comes to security policies, I think there will be some changes. Maybe Trump will meet Kim Jong-un again to showcase he's doing something. But, and also, the problem is Trump is trying to take a transactional approach to security issues, very business-minded. So he's very different from Biden. So that's why I think there will be more changes if Trump is elected. But Biden is elected, there will be no dramatic changes in policies to East Asia.
Just want to thank you both for the time you took to come and speak with us today. So my first comment is that I can't help but imagine we're in a new kind of domino theory moment, like the moment that China makes a move on Taiwan, like the way that series of events will play out. So that was really interesting to hear you talk about that. So I'm on faculty here in music, actually, but before I did graduate study in music, I worked in political communication. And so my question is, what does the role of media framing play on the generation of public opinion about this issue in the US? Because I think it's every other day where we hear, oh, this happened in the South China Sea, this happened in the Taiwan Strait, this happened, et cetera. We hear about whatever month in the summer it is when the US does the exercises with South Korea and Japan. There's always, okay, Beijing reacted this way. I just kind of want to know what I guess the standard should be for us to evaluate when we hear tension is rising in X way, does that actually look like what we're supposed to think it looks like, kind of behind the scenes, or is there something at play that the narrative is supposed to be, this conflict is inevitable and we should be worried about it?
It's a fantastic question, and it's a very hard question to end on. I know that our time is limited. I don't want to hold you hostage to the rest of your night, but I will just offer one sort of comment. I worked for President Obama. I worked closely with Vice President Biden. I'm very sympathetic to them as individuals. I think that the challenge in political communication around China is that it's easier to be strong and wrong than it is to be nuanced and right, in the sense that people don't want to hear someone talk for 10 minutes about what we should be doing to balance our interests with China or, balance of power politics. They want to know, are we going to win or not? And the Biden administration just hasn't felt comfortable saying, damn it, we're going to win. They talk about building a lattice work of alliances in Asia to sort of limit China's expansion of influence. When I hear lattice, I think of Home Depot and sort of that flimsy stuff that you buy to staple onto, your gardenware. That's not strong. That's not like iron, steel, tough. The reason that I understand the reason the Biden administration does this. They want to create a contrast between competence and chaos, and to argue that they are steady hands that will competently manage a very complex, serious relationship, and that the other guy, Donald Trump, represents chaos, who would be erratic, emotional, and could drag us into a war that 73% of Americans oppose. So this is driven by politics, but the politics are sort of short-term, near-term, and focused on the period between now and November. The problem with this, and this will be my final thought, and I'd love to hear your reaction after we're finished here, but the problem with this is that if you leave a vacuum without explaining what the hell are we trying to do, it's going to get filled by people who are strong and wrong, who just want to say, let's take down the regime, let's take it to the Chinese, and that will cause the Biden administration to ultimately be back-footed and outflanked, which is not a great place for them to be. So the Biden administration wants the debate that we all have around China to be around effective versus ineffective, competent versus chaos. The Trump team wants the debate to be about strong versus weak, with them representing strength and Biden representing weakness. And whichever one of those framings you see more often in the coming 6 months will be an indicator of which side is sort of controlling the narrative around China going forward.
Thank you.